afternoon and welcome to our third Waterfront Forum. We are delighted to have more than 280 people who RSVP'd for today. I think everyone is interested in Edmonds history. I know I certainly am. My name is Daniel Johnson. I'm the CEO of Edmonds Waterfront Center, home of the Edmonds Senior Center. You know, in our last forum, we learned about Indigenous people of the Puget Sound by Dennis Lewark of the Suquamish tribe. And it's with that inspiration that I want to pay tribute and acknowledge that we are on the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish tribes. As we learned, the Coast Salish represent a large collection of many tribes with distinct cultures and languages who served as stewards of the land and sea for more than 14,000 years. So it is with great honor that we pay our respect to elders past and present. Well, our staff of the Edmonds Waterfront Center continue to ready the building to welcome guests as soon as COVID restrictions allow. Watch for the announcement of our virtual opening and guided tour by Rick Steves. That'll be coming up in the coming weeks. Our vision for the center has always been to create a space for the community to come and gather, learn, and celebrate. Luckily, we are getting darn good at doing that virtually as we wait for the Waterfront Center to open. We are delighted to be welcoming you to our third presentation of Edmonds from the Beginning, a three-part Zoom series for presentations by local experts. Today's topic is Early Settlers Sawmill Town, presented by Executive Director of the Edmonds Historical Museum, Katie Kelly. I had a chance to spend a little bit of time with Katie, and her passion for history is contagious. Katie has served in that position as Executive Director for the Historical Museum for 6 years. She's an Edmonds girl. After graduating from Edmonds Holy Rosary School, she went on to earn her bachelor's in history from Oglethorpe University in Atlanta. So the way it will work today is Katie will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open up to 10 minutes of questions. So if you have questions during the presentation, go ahead and just type that into the chat or Q&A, and I'll pose those questions to Katie at the end of her remarks. So with that, would you please welcome Katie Kelly.
Sure. Thank you so much for allowing me to be here today, and thank you for that introduction, Daniel. I'm very excited to talk to you guys about early Edmonds. I'm very passionate about history, and I think this is a wonderful series to really discuss in depth how important the Edmonds area was. Our history is not just when George Brackett stumbled upon this land. It goes back thousands of years, which you have learned about, and I'm so grateful to have the opportunity to join those in telling a portion of the story of this area. Edmonds was an important part of the Coast Salish narrative and was also an important part of the lives of the early settlers to the area. I wish I could tell you everything about Edmonds history, but I definitely don't have the time. I would encourage you, once our museum reopens to the public, to come in and discover so much more. And with that note, I want to talk to you first about what was kind of going on in the Puget Sound region in the late 1800s in order to connect Edmonds to the broader story and her success as a city. White settlers came to the Seattle area in 1851, establishing a town site they first called New York, and then adding a word from the Chinook jargon meaning by and by, New York, Alki. They soon moved a short distance across Elliott Bay to what is now the historic Pioneer District. This village was soon called Seattle in recognition of Chief Sealth. The new town's principal economic support was Henry Yesler's lumber mill, built in 1853. Much of the mill's production went to the booming city of San Francisco, but the mill also supplied lumber to the fledgling cities and towns throughout the Puget Sound region. In the early 1870s, the Northern Pacific Railroad Company announced that its transcontinental railroad western terminus would be at Tacoma, some 40 miles south of Seattle. Though this was a disappointment to Seattle, they would manage later to force a connection with the Northern Pacific shortly after its completion in 1883. At this time, a young fellow named George Brackett, who some of you may have heard of, had come west from Canada by way of Wisconsin. First to San Francisco looking for gold, then to Seattle in the late 1860s to meet his brother James. As a lumberman, he began logging operations in the Seattle and the Ballard and Magnolia area. Formed in 1853, Washington Territory encompassed an expansive area that was soon cut back by the establishment of Idaho and Montana territories. In 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act, which allowed U.S. citizens or those intending to become citizens, and who were either the head of the family or single and over 21, to claim 160 acres of public land. And if the couple was married, they could double that to 320. The claimant had 7 years to fulfill the terms, which included living on the land, improving it, and paying a registration fee. In the decades that followed, Congress would amend and expand the scope of the homesteading legislation. Over the next 100 years, some 2 million applicants tried their hand at homesteading. About 40% proved up and gained title to 273 million acres across 30 states. Those contemplating a move to Washington had a variety of information at their disposal. During the territorial era, there was no shortage of optimistic descriptions penned by many groups, hoping to encourage emigration to the region. Isaac Stevens, the territory's first governor, promoted Washington's vast natural resources, hoping to attract a sufficient number of settlers to put the territory on a path to eventual statehood. Others who were keen to promote the territory's richness included railroad companies, land speculators, and later logging companies, each intent on selling their land to settlers. While many saw opportunity, there were other reminders the area was undeveloped. Boosters tried to spin the area's lack of development as untapped potential and heavily timbered mountainous ranges as gorgeous scenery. Although such accounts hinted at the obstacles that settlers might face in the northwest corner of the nation, reports of fertile soil, temperate weather was motivation enough to bring enterprising settlers to leave their homes and countries to stake claims in the region. George Brackett was one such man. In 1870, while setting out from Seattle to search for new virgin forests, Brackett put his boat ashore during a storm. He was drawn by the abundant trees, the gently sloping hillside, creating an amphitheater setting with breathtaking views of the Puget Sound. Unbeknownst to him, he had inadvertently stumbled upon the over 140-acre preemptive land claim of Pleasant Ewell made in 1866. By 1870, Ewell had sold his claim to 3 businessmen, Morris Frost, Jacob Fowler, and Nat Fowler, Mukilteo pioneers. Brackett purchased this land in the mid-1870s for $650. He had never forgotten the lush forested land he had come across, the perfect setting to attract settlers to the area and a town site. Soon after, Brackett completed his logging operations in Seattle and moved his oxen and logging equipment to the site. He built a cabin for his wife and young son just north of what is Edmonds Street and worked towards draining the marshland and clearing the land near the waterfront. At the same time, Brackett would make numerous trips into Seattle to persuade new arrivals to invest in his town site. Oral histories in our collection indicate that many early settlers were destined for Seattle or other booming towns in the Pacific Northwest. But at some point, they ran into George Brackett, who convinced them to settle in Edmonds. In a detailed account, Ethel Smith Moat described her family's journey from Pennsylvania to Edmonds in 1884. Her father, Wellington, had, quote, caught the Western fever the previous year and decided there was no cure except to go west. Armed with an adventurous spirit, Smith and his friend, Frank Armstrong, headed to Seattle, where they ran across George Brackett, who gave them a successful sales pitch about a place 17 miles to the north. By this time, Brackett had platted the land, added a post office, and officially named the town Edmonds. He had laid the town out into lots, what Smith described as, quote, city lots and a wilderness of trees. And Brackett, shrewd businessman that he was, hadn't included his house in the plat. Smith and Armstrong purchased the first 2 lots in the town site of Edmonds. Once their houses were constructed, the men sent for their families. Ethel recalled that they were armed with provisions and blankets. The 2 families rode in the immigrant car heading west on the railroad, which was only furnished with a straw mattress and a small stove at the end for light cooking. Riders were responsible for bringing their own food and bedding. They had stopped at Matin, Illinois for 2 weeks to visit her aunt and uncle, Clara and Matthew Heiner. 3 years later, the Heiner family would move to Edmonds and be integral to its history. The family then boarded the Union Pacific, which had just become the first railroad to connect to the Pacific Northwest. They changed cars in Portland, Oregon, and traveled on the Northern Pacific to Tacoma. Then they had to take a ship to Seattle, where there another boat would carry them on to Edmonds. When the Smith and Armstrong families arrived at Edmonds, Brackett had a small general store at the head of the dock. A path was cleared leading to the Smith home at what is now the corner of 3rd and Main Street, Claire's Pantry. Ethel's recollections describe that though it was 3 blocks from the water, quote, you could not see it because of the trees and brush. Following the Bracketts, Smiths, and Armstrongs, more settlers and families arrived at the Edmonds town site. The 1887 Puget Sound Folk Directory listed Snohomish County's population in 1880 at 1,113. And by 1885, it had more than doubled to 2,479. Edmonds had 22 men listed in the directory, 15 laborers, 4 farmers, 1 lumber manufacturer, 1 carpenter, and 1 general store owner. By 1895, the Folk Directory listed the population of Edmonds at, quote, about 750. Not including rural districts to the north, south, or east. As mentioned, 1884 was a big year for Edmonds. The town was named and platted, a post office was established, and Edmonds School District 15 held its first classes for students. As Brackett cleared the land, settlers continued to trickle in, and an application to the post office department was made and granted. As you can imagine, the mail service at the time was drastically different than we know today. A lone horseman trekked through the woods on established native trails past Lake Ballinger and past the northern edge of Lake Washington to the village of Bothell. Here, outgoing mail would be exchanged for incoming, the saddlebags were placed on the horse, and the trail was then retraced. Mail would then be distributed to settlers as best as they could. With more families arriving, Edmonds saw a surge in young children who needed to be educated. In 1884, the Edmonds School District held its first classes for 6 students in George Brackett's feed barn. According to one of the students, it, quote, held meager supplies and the seats and desks were doubled, 2 students to each seat. Consequently, because of this setup, studying did not always happen. The population continued to increase and attendance in the school did as well. Between 1886 and 1887, attendance rose by 4 students, and a new schoolhouse was built on a knoll between 3rd and 4th, just north of Main Street. Then in 1889, the same year Washington achieved statehood, and the year before Edmonds incorporated, attendance had reached 32 students and the building was enlarged. By 1891, accommodations were once again tight, and Brackett donated a site for a proper school building, this time situated at 7th and Main Street. This wood frame building served students until 1928, when a new fireproof building was constructed. That building is still standing and known as the Francis Anderson Center. In May 1890, a petition was passed along to the residents of Edmonds asking the county for an election on incorporation. And on Monday, August 11th, the Board of the County Commissioners declared that Edmonds had enough votes and would become a village of the 4th class, to be designated as the town of Edmonds. The town would cover an area of about 600 acres and become the first incorporated city in Snohomish County. The town busily elected officers to city council, and George Brackett was named the first mayor. In the following months, the council was busy using its authority to pass a rash of regulatory ordinances covering liquor traffic, gaming tables, shows, stock at large, dogs, nuisances, one to, quote, prevent and punish gambling, and another to, quote, govern houses of ill fame. They even granted the first liquor license to C.D. Gaylord under a new saloon ordinance. Frances Anderson, who had come to Edmonds as a young child in 1894, recalled her mother forbidding her to go down to past 2nd Street because of the saloons and depravity happening on the waterfront. Another big transformative event in Edmonds history happened in 1890. Speculation ran rampant that the Great Northern Railway was coming through Edmonds, and the Minneapolis Realty and Investment Company selected Edmonds as a site for its development operations. The company purchased this town site and adjacent property from Brackett, a total of 455 acres, for $36,000. Brackett, who had acquired a considerable amount of land, still retained 100 acres. The company immediately replatted the town, built a hotel, a wharf, and an office building that was later used as the post office. Unfortunately, the anticipated land boom failed to happen, and when the panic of the early 1890s materialized, The holdings reverted back to Brackett. Hard times were felt in Edmonds with fewer settlers, but in spite of the Depression, Edmonds was moving forward. On June 17, 1891, Matt Heiner noted that, quote, the track lane engine rounded Hamlin's Point, which is now Point Edwards, on the Great Northern Grade at 5 p.m. The train had reached Edmonds and had acquired much of the property from Captain William Hamlin, who had purchased a considerable acreage in the area in 1881 and had moved his family permanently to Edmonds in 1890. Although the last decade of the 19th century opened with less industrial activity, it was the shingle industry that really pulled Edmonds through those difficult years. Shingles were becoming a popular item in building homes, and the market for them continued through the slow years. The 1894 City Directory describes the manufacturing and shipping of large quantities of lumber and cedar shakes in 5 mills in the area. Starting in 1888, the Edmonds waterfront was lined with shingle mills. They say as many as 12 were located on the waterfront at one time. This was the backbone of the local economy and provided work for many people in the area. Proximity was everything. Successful mills in the Snohomish County and elsewhere set up along the waterfront. In Edmonds, the mills were located along Front Street, now called Sunset Ave, with wharves extending into the water. The tall smokestacks of the mills, along with factory buildings, which manufactured and processed everything from cigars to shark skins, were a familiar sight on the Edmonds waterfront for many years. Snohomish County can trace its origins to the thick forest of Douglas fir, spruce, hemlock, and western red cedar that used to abundantly line the hills and valleys of the land. Despite the great advantages and availability of lumber and accessible rivers and ports, the timber industry developed slowly in Snohomish County. Providing logs for the larger mills in Seattle, Utsalati, Port Ludlow, and Port Gamble, the county functioned mostly as a supplier for many years. However, by the 1870s, logging and shingle mills were steadily gaining a presence in the county. Even before Edmonds was incorporated, logging and shingle mills were an important part of its history. When Brackett first set foot on the shore during the storm in 1870, there was already an inhabited cabin to the south of Eel's Claim. The occupant, Daniel Hines, was, quote, engaged in making the old hand-shaved shingles, which passed almost as currency among pioneers. Little did Brackett know then, but these shingles would bring many more ambitious and enterprising men in his footsteps. In 1876, when Brackett completed his Seattle logging operations and had moved permanently to Edmonds, he found 2 new neighbors. Thomas Kennedy, a retired sailor living to the north of his property, and J.C. Purcell, whose claim was on the tidelands to the south. While he cleared the land, he reserved a section and opened Edmonds' first sawmill in 1889. The mill had a capacity of 25,000 feet of lumber per day, and it was the first of many that would see Edmonds through economic hardships. Others soon followed and staked claims. By 1909, just 20 years after the city incorporated, the Edmonds Tribune reported that 12 manufacturing plants were running at full capacity, and most of them were manufacturing shingles. In all, they represented $2.2 million invested capital. As time went on, the shingle industry in Snohomish County and Edmonds met with one of its most formidable opponents, geography. With each passing year, the cedar supply got further and further away, and the workload became harder to replicate. When timber began to get scarce, the Quality, Oakland, and Rainbow mills arranged to have cedar logs brought in from British Columbia. By 1923, Edmonds was back down to operating 5 mills. As the resource diminished, other industries took their place on the waterfront. Similar to the early years of homesteading, Edmonds used propaganda and tantalizing advertisements to lure people and businesses to its shores. As an additional incentive, large acres of land were given as a bonus to incoming businesses. For example, in 1894, a group of citizens offered 120 acres to a company from Newcastle, Pennsylvania, for the construction of an iron foundry. Similarly, in 1904, Soper Howell, head of the Chamber of Commerce, purchased 9 acres of waterfront property near the south end of the town limits as an inducement to potential industries. Although many industries failed to prosper, under this practice, Edmonds saw factories for the production of boltworks, Excelsior boxes, and explosives, in addition to a smelter and a shark skin processing plant. By 1911 and 1920, other industries included a glove factory, a sash and door company, and A.M. Sanford's Spring Fisher fishing reels, camp stools, and tent stakes. By the 1920s and early 1930s, Snohomish County shingle mills ran day and night, supply markets up and down the West Coast. Boats were loaded daily and transported millions of shingles each month to Alaska, California, and points in between. The busy shingle industry helped insulate Edmonds from the Great Depression, and in July 1933, the Quality Mill on the site of the present-day Waterfront Center added 23 jobs to its payroll. The Second World War brought another wave of outside industrial employment to Edmonds, especially war industries. The Pointer Willamette Company, who built steel barges for the Navy, moved to the waterfront. Other shipbuilding and boat industries sprang up. In August 1943, the two remaining shingle firms, the Oakland and the Quality Shingle Mill, joined forces under the Quality name. The Oakland plant, just north of the ferry dock, was dismantled. Unfortunately, on June 1st, 1951, the end of the industrial mill era in Edmonds came to a close. The mills had carried Edmonds through two depressions and a series of ill-fated industrial experiments. The following day, piece by piece, the last remnants of an era disappeared for the Edmonds waterfront. During the growth and decline of Edmonds shingle industry, Edmonds went from a small town with, quote, nothing but stumps and mud to paved streets and sidewalks, from horse and buggy to the first automobile, and from a working class lumber town to an arts and culture mecca. Though that era in Edmonds history is closed, many of the buildings, houses, and other tangible features are still present. They are an important reminder of the perseverance of the settlers in creating what we know as Edmonds.
Katie, what a great presentation. I really love the photos. In fact, I wanted to ask, how would one go about getting copies of photos that are available at the museum?
So just to contact us, you could do it through our email, info@historicedmonds.org. We do photo reproductions for a fee, but that's one of our many things that people are always asking us about.
Yeah, so those were awesome. So let's go to some of the questions. Thank you for sending these in. These have been rolling in during the presentation. So the first question was, ultimately, what happened to end the shingle mills?
So basically, like I mentioned, more industries were coming in. There was new building materials that were replacing shingles, and the timber sources just kept receding further and further away. So it became more and more expensive to work the forests, to bring them back down to the mills, and to produce them.
Yeah, it sounded like it happened pretty abruptly at the very end. Another question was, any information you have on the origins of the city's name, Edmonds?
Yes, so George Brackett was, he followed the career of the Vermont Senator George Franklin Edmonds. And so he decided to name the post office after Edmonds. But the fun story is that Edmonds' last name, it was Edmunds, and kind of in the pathway through writing it down and submitting it, a crease in the paper made the U look like an O. And so they ended up keeping the O name for Edmonds. And that's kind of how we got our name.
That's a great story. So there's a couple of questions here related to the museum. When did the museum open?
The museum officially opened on August 3rd, 1973.
And so during the pandemic, what resources are available to people online?
So we have research request services, we have the photograph services, and people can donate artifacts, and they can do this either through our website or they can do it through email. And we've been scheduling some appointments, trying to get people in here.
Okay, that is good to know. Another question was, does the museum also cover the history of the ferry system and mosquito fleet?
Yes, so we have a really great research library that contains multiple reference and research materials on all sorts of topics. But that's one of the big ones that we do have. We have a lot on the ferry system and the mosquito fleets, and waterway transportation.
Well, I look forward to checking that out as soon as you will allow people into the museum. Well, we've run out of time, and I wanted to thank you again, Katie. What a great presentation.
Yeah.
Looking forward to learning more. So thank you all for coming. I want you to all watch for the next Edmonds Waterfront Forum. We have not selected dates yet, but the topic is going to be Edmonds Arts and Culture. So watch for that. Thank you all again for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.